The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer above the empty corridor, and Brooke Sullivan stood outside the secure ICU wing at 2:07 a.m., reading a patient chart she wasn't supposed to access. The file felt heavy in her hands, heavier than it should have been. Room 347. 24-year-old Army Ranger, admitted 3 days ago from Marja with what the official documentation called combat-related injury sustained during routine patrol operations. Routine. That word didn't match anything in the medical record in front of her. She shifted her weight against the cold steel of the supply cabinet behind her, her scrub still damp from the 11 p.m. code in the cardiac wing where she'd spent 6 hours watching a 73-year-old man's heart refuse to cooperate with modern medicine. The antiseptic smell of the hospital clung to her like a second skin, sharp and chemical, mixed with the fading copper scent of blood that no amount of hand-washing ever completely removed. Her fingers traced the edge of the chart, feeling the irregularity in the paper where sections had been redacted, thick black marker obscuring the medical history, the initial assessment, the intake notes. Entire paragraphs erased as if they'd never existed. The young ranger's injury pattern was inconsistent. She knew enough about penetrating trauma after 23 years in trauma medicine, 15 of those as a cardiac nurse, 8 before that in circumstances she no longer spoke about, to recognize when something didn't fit. The chest wound showed signs of field medicine, hasty closure, deliberate infection control that went beyond standard protocol. The sutures were military grade, the dressing technique precise in a way that suggested someone with serious training had stabilized him before he arrived at Sacred Heart. But the pharmaceutical orders didn't match. She'd pulled the medication administration records from the hospital system, cross-referenced them with the documented treatment plan, and the numbers were wrong. Antibiotics prescribed at doses that made sense for contaminated combat wounds. Anti-inflammatory medications that suggested underlying tissue damage far more extensive than the chart indicated. And then the opioid protocols, locked down, restricted, requiring Caldwell's personal authorization for each dose. That wasn't standard post-operative pain management. That was damage control. That was someone trying to keep a patient stable while keeping something else buried. She turned the page, her breathing steady, her pulse even. The trembling in her hands had nothing to do with fear. It was recognition. It was muscle memory firing across 2 decades like a rifle shot echoing through a valley. This ranger had been hurt in ways the hospital's official records refused to acknowledge, and someone at the highest level of Sacred Heart's administration had made a calculated decision to hide it. The redacted sections. The inconsistent injury patterns. The pharmaceutical orders that didn't match. The way Dr. James Caldwell had personally approved every single treatment protocol despite this not being his assigned case. She'd verified that an hour ago, scrolling through the hospital's department assignments on the second-floor computer terminal, the one that usually just hummed to itself in the empty dark. Caldwell was trauma division director, yes, but he didn't supervise cardiac recovery. He had no reason to be involved in post-operative pain management for a patient categorized as stable. Unless there was something else. Unless there was something that needed managing beyond the medical. That was when she heard the footsteps. The sound came from around the corner of the corridor, deliberate, unhurried, expensive leather shoes moving against linoleum tile with a rhythm that suggested someone who'd learned long ago that urgency was a sign of weakness. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. Not boots. Not military. Just shoes that cost more than her monthly rent, and a man who wore them like a threat. Brooke closed the file with the kind of precision that suggested she'd been making small, controlled movements her entire professional life. She turned toward the sound, her shoulders back, her jaw set in that expression that nurses perfected, the face of someone who belonged everywhere because she acted like she belonged everywhere, the invisible armor of competence worn like a second skin. Dr. James Caldwell rounded the corner of the secure ICU wing at 2:09 a.m., and his eyes found her immediately. Not searching. Finding. As if he'd known exactly where she would be. His expression shifted in the space of a heartbeat, surprise, calculation, something that looked almost like fear before he locked it down behind the polished mask of administrative authority. He was 56 years old, his hair silver at the temples in the way that made male doctors look distinguished rather than aging, his suit tailored to a precision that suggested he understood the language of power better than most people understood their own native tongue. His presence made the air pressure change. The hallway suddenly felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls had moved closer while she wasn't looking. Sullivan. Not a greeting. An accusation. You're not scheduled for this wing. Chart review. Her voice was soft, deferential, the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned early not to give people like him anything to use against her. Ran across an inconsistency in the ranger's medication orders. Thought I'd verify the documentation before I signed off on the shift notes. She watched him process that, watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. He was smart, genuinely smart, the kind of surgeon who kept people alive through sheer force of intellect and technique, and that made him more dangerous than if he'd just been arrogant. Smart men anticipated problems. Smart men planned solutions. Smart men understood when someone had seen something she wasn't supposed to see, and smart men made sure those people learned to keep their mouths closed. The ranger's care is managed at my discretion. His voice was level, conversational, the tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow to understand. I don't need a cardiac nurse second-guessing treatment protocols in the middle of the night. I'm not second-guessing. She held out the file with the kind of steadiness that came from 10 years of holding bleeding people's hands while disaster happened around them. I'm verifying. It's part of the job. He took the file from her, and his fingers were cold when they brushed against hers, deliberate, she thought, a way of establishing dominance. His eyes moved across the pages, and she watched something harden in his expression. Not anger. Something colder than anger. Something that looked like a decision being made. You accessed restricted files, he said quietly. Files you don't have clearance for. Files marked confidential. The chart is in the system. I pulled the medication administration records using my access credentials. You have been a cardiac nurse at Sacred Heart for exactly 3 years and 4 months. His voice was still quiet, which made it worse. You are good at what you do. You're reliable, punctual, competent during codes. But you seem to have developed a concerning habit of involving yourself in matters outside your department. He closed the file. The sound was like a closing door. I'm reassigning you, effective immediately. You'll move to rotating shifts, nights, days, weekends. We need flexibility in the cardiac unit, and you seem to have energy to spare for investigative work. Perhaps variable hours will keep you occupied. He paused, and when he spoke again, there was something in his voice that made her understand, with absolute clarity, that she'd just made an enemy of a man who knew how to be careful about removing people from his world. If this pattern of concern about cases outside your purview continues, I may need to recommend a transfer. I hear the night clinic across town is looking for experienced staff. You'd be perfect for that environment. Not a threat. A promise. Yes, doctor, she said, and she felt something shift in her chest, something old and familiar, something that had been sleeping for 20 years and was just beginning to stir. He walked past her without another word, and she stood alone in the corridor again, the file gone, the inconsistencies unresolved, the secret buried deeper than it had been before. But her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. And under the left edge of her jacket, folded and sewn into the lining where no one could see it, was a faded unit patch with the call sign Reaper 6 stitched in thread that had survived 2 decades of dry cleaning and forgetting. 20 years ago, she had been Major Brooke Sullivan, attached to 3rd Medical Battalion, Army Rangers, operating out of a forward operating base in Marja when the world was nothing but dust and gunfire and the terrible mathematics of trauma surgery performed on people who shouldn't have survived but did because she wouldn't let them die. She'd been young then, 24 years old, with hands that moved faster than her mind could follow and a reputation for pulling Rangers out of situations that should have been terminal. She'd carried a kid out of a burning compound for 2 miles under fire, the child's lungs screaming from smoke inhalation, and she'd kept moving because stopping meant death and she wasn't done saving people yet. And then one operation went sideways. Orders came. Not through normal channels. Through the Pentagon. through people who didn't identify themselves but who made it clear that Major Brooke Sullivan had seen something she wasn't supposed to see, knew something that needed to stay classified, and would be doing her country a service by ceasing to exist in any official capacity. Her decorations were sealed. Her service record was redacted. She was given a new name, a new social security number, a careful explanation about compartmentalization and national security. She was given a choice: disappear, or have everyone she'd ever saved suddenly die in traffic accidents, random muggings, ordinary accidents that weren't accidents at all. She'd chosen to disappear. She'd become Brooke Sullivan, civilian, and she'd learned to keep her hand steady and her voice soft and her eyes down, and for 3 years and 4 months she'd worked in the cardiac wing of a hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina, watching people die and being good at keeping them alive, and she'd almost convinced herself that she'd made peace with invisibility, that healing broken hearts was enough of a purpose to justify taking the erasure, that keeping her mouth shut was an acceptable price for keeping other people breathing. But there was something in that ranger's file. Something that smelled like the operation she used to run. Something that required redaction and denial and the kind of careful erasure that only happened when the Pentagon decided someone's survival was worth lying about. The corridor was quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer. And Brooke Sullivan stood alone in the dark, her hand steady, her heart refusing to accept that invisibility had ever really been peace at all. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical prayer as Brooke moved through the hallway Tuesday morning, her temporary badge clipped to her scrubs like a scarlet letter: restricted access, limited floors, the hospital's way of saying she was already gone. The air felt different when you knew they were watching. Dr. Caldwell stood outside room 347 when she arrived for rounds, his white coat pristine, his voice carrying the particular edge of a man who had decided someone needed breaking. The ranger's family sat inside, mother in a chair pulled close to the bed, father standing with arms crossed, sister scrolling through her phone with the exhausted tension of people who had stopped sleeping normally weeks ago. "Nurse Sullivan," Dr. Caldwell said, loud enough for them to hear. Not a question. A summons. She stepped forward, her jaw tightening a fraction of an inch, the only tell she would permit herself. "Did you administer 10 milligrams of morphine to this patient yesterday at 14:30 hours?" She checked her notes. The handwriting was hers, unmistakable. 5 milligrams, doctor. As prescribed in the chart. He held up a printout. His hands didn't shake. That was what made it effective, the absolute certainty of a man wielding falsified documents like a surgeon wielding a scalpel. "This says 10. Your medication error could have sent this young man into respiratory depression. Could have killed him." He let the words hang in the sterile air. The mother's hand found her son's arm. The father's face went red. The sister stopped scrolling. "This patient is under my direct care, and I expect my orders to be followed precisely. Not interpreted. Not negotiated. Followed." Brooke took one measured breath. She didn't look away from his eyes. That was important, that was discipline. A single tear traced her cheek, the kind that comes from rage so controlled it has nowhere else to go. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, her voice steady as a surgeon's hands. "I documented everything, doctor." The statement landed like a round in a chamber. He blinked once. But the moment passed, and his composure reassembled itself like a shattered windshield fused back together. "You're reassigned effective immediately. Night shift rotation with swing coverage. General medicine floor, second wing. You'll need remedial training before you're cleared for ICU work again. Night shift Nancy needs to remember the basics." He said it loud enough for the family to hear. Loud enough for the nurses clustering at the station to pause. Loud enough for the architecture of reputation to crack. By Wednesday, her badge had been recalibrated to restricted access, no secure wings, no ICU, no rooms where classified patients lay recuperating. By Thursday, she found her locker reassigned to a smaller one 3 hallways over, her personal items boxed up like she'd already left. A picture of her with her mother from 2 years ago. A coffee mug someone had given her for 3 years of perfect shift attendance. The faded unit patch she kept sewn inside her jacket lining, the only artifact from before the erasure, the only proof that Major Brooke Sullivan had ever existed at all. The rotating shifts began Friday night. Days Monday and Tuesday, nights Wednesday and Thursday, swings Friday and Saturday. 12 hours on her feet in fluorescent purgatory, then home to an apartment that smelled like old coffee and the kind of silence that comes when you've cut yourself off from everyone who might ask questions. Her hands ached by Sunday morning. Her eyes had developed the hollow quality of someone who hadn't slept without dreaming of IEDs and children's screams in 3 weeks. The break room was where it really happened. Tuesday morning, before her night shift, she sat down with her sandwich at the small table by the window. Linda from the ICU looked up, made eye contact for exactly 1 second, then gathered her things and left without speaking. Marcus from trauma followed 30 seconds later. Even the travel nurse from pediatrics, the one who'd only been at Sacred Heart for 6 weeks, stood up and walked out when Brooke opened her lunch container. The fluorescent light above the table flickered like it was dying in slow motion, casting everything in that particular white that made people look like ghosts of themselves. She ate her sandwich alone. Turkey and Swiss on wheat, the same thing she'd been eating for 3 years. The bread felt like cardboard. Or maybe that was just what abandonment tasted like. By Friday, her official write-up appeared on the unit board where everyone could see it. Medication error, Sullivan, B. Final warning. The handwriting was Dr. Caldwell's, precise and authoritative. The error was fabricated. She documented everything in her own notes, timestamps and dosages in her neat military script, but documentation meant nothing when the institutional power belonged to the man with the falsified chart and the phone number to whoever ran the hospital's compliance office. She photographed her write-up with her phone. Evidence of something. Proof of something. She wasn't sure what yet. That afternoon, she overheard Dr. Caldwell on the phone in his office. The door cracked open just far enough for his voice to carry down the hallway in fragments. She's seen too much, the records are inconsistent. I need her gone before she connects the dots, the transfer paperwork goes through Monday. His tone was conversational, the way you discuss moving an inconvenient piece of furniture. The night clinic in Durham. It's 20 miles out. Rotating shifts. She won't last 3 months. Security stopped her at the staff entrance that evening, just as her shift ended. A woman in a Navy uniform with a security badge that caught the late afternoon light like a knife. Your badge needs recalibration, the woman said, though there was nothing wrong with Brooke's temporary pass. They took it anyway, handed her a paper slip, visitor pass, valid for 10 days, escort required for all restricted areas. 10 days to wrap up her life before the hospital made it official. She drove home on roads she'd traveled 1,000 times, past the same strip malls and traffic lights and billboards advertising personal injury lawyers. The sky was grey. It had been grey for days. Her apartment was exactly how she'd left it, coffee maker on the counter, unmade bed, a stack of medical journals she no longer had the energy to read. She poured herself 3 fingers of bourbon and stood at the window watching the rain start to fall, hammering the parking lot like applause from a crowd that had already forgotten her name. The next morning brought a package to the break room, care supplies for deployed troops, left by a visiting service member who still believed in the power of MREs and snack packs to bridge the distance between home and everywhere else. Brooke saw it from the hallway, beef stew in brownie packet, peanut butter cracker meal, a sleeve of instant coffee. Standard issue. The smell of it, that particular blend of cardboard and salt and preservation, hit her like a physical force. Marja. Dust. Gunfire. The screams of a child trapped in a collapsed structure while insurgents fired from 3 angles and her hands moved through the rubble with the kind of precision that only came when you'd already decided your own life didn't matter as much as someone else's. She didn't touch the MRE package. But she stared at it for so long the day shift nurse asked if she was okay. Fine, Brooke said. Just a word. Nothing more. By Tuesday morning, she was checking the Ranger's room from a distance, unable to access the ICU floor but able to catch glimpses through the observation windows when she passed by on general medicine rounds. He was still sedated. Heavily sedated. The pharmaceutical logs showed benzodiazepines beyond what his injuries required, opioids that didn't match his pain level. Something was being maintained. Hidden. Protected. The alarm started at exactly 9:17 a.m. The intercom buzzed at 11:11 a.m. on a Wednesday, the kind of mechanical sound that usually meant pharmacy calling with a missing order or housekeeping needing bed linens. Brooke didn't look up from the medication cart she was restocking on the 4th floor, 2 levels below the ICU where she no longer belonged. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, each syringe and vial sliding into its designated slot, the rhythmic precision of someone whose muscle memory required no conscious thought. She'd learned long ago that efficiency was invisibility. Stay quiet. Stay useful. Stay forgotten. But the conversation drifting from the administrator's office 3 doors down wasn't about linens or missing lab results. Liability concerns, she heard Dr. Caldwell say, his voice that particular brand of measured that meant calculated cruelty. A nurse who exceeds her scope of practice creates exposure. One documentation error leads to another. Eventually someone gets hurt, and we're the ones paying settlements. The administrator's voice was harder to catch, something about pattern and competency evaluation. Brooke's hands didn't pause. The syringe in her right hand continued its arc toward the cart. Her breathing didn't change. But her jaw tightened at an angle only someone trained in combat medicine would recognize, the physical signature of a person holding something back. I've been considering her placement, Dr. Caldwell continued. The night clinic across town has been asking for additional nursing support. The commute is brutal, 40 minutes from here, but it would free up a slot on my floor for someone more aligned with institutional standards. Aligned. The word hung in the air like poison gas. What it meant was obedient. What it meant was someone who wouldn't ask questions about redacted medical files or inconsistent injury patterns or pharmaceutical orders that didn't match documented treatment protocols. By Friday afternoon, the transfer request appeared in Brooke's inbox with a subject line that read Staffing Optimization, Night Clinic Reassignment, Pending. The message was written in the kind of corporate language that made termination sound like opportunity. This lateral move will broaden your clinical exposure while addressing departmental restructuring needs. The night clinic. 40 minutes away. Evening shifts bleeding into nights. Working with temporary staff who changed weekly, with minimal supervision, in a facility that handled routine urgent care and seasonal flu clinics. It was, in every practical sense, exile. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked to the break room during her 30-minute lunch and sat in the plastic chair that faced the window overlooking the parking garage. The autumn sun cut through the glass at a sharp angle, harsh and unforgiving. Her reflection looked back at her from the window, a woman in teal scrubs, hair pulled back in a regulation bun, the physical appearance of someone utterly ordinary. No one would look at her and think anything other than nurse. No one would see the muscle under the scrubs, the calluses on her palms, the way her eyes tracked exits and identified threats the way most people track time. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, currently draped over her chair in the locker room 3 floors below, had started to fray at the edges. 3 years of being worn underneath everything, hidden against her ribs, had worn the embroidery thin. She touched the patch maybe once a week, usually late at night when she sat in her car with the engine dead, trying to remember why she'd agreed to disappear. That patch was the last physical proof that Major Brooke Sullivan had ever existed, that she'd once been someone whose name mattered, whose decision saved lives, whose presence commanded a room without her having to speak a word. Now she was being shuffled out to a clinic 40 minutes away, working nights, gradually erased from the institution that had briefly needed her skills. It was elegant, really. Dr. Caldwell wasn't confronting her. He wasn't creating another public scene. He was doing something more sophisticated. He was making her irrelevant by administrative decree. The reassignment request sat in her inbox for 3 days without response. By Monday morning, the administrator had sent a follow-up message marked urgent, approval needed by end of day. By Tuesday, the night clinic director had already begun sending her the night shift schedule. By Wednesday, the other nurses on the floor had received the announcement, Please welcome the night clinic's new evening charge nurse, effective next month. It wasn't an announcement about Brooke. It was an announcement that her position was being filled by someone else. The subliminal message was clear: she was already gone. What struck her hardest wasn't the transfer or the isolation or even the quiet campaign to make her position untenable. It was the systematic nature of it. Dr. Caldwell hadn't made another public spectacle. He hadn't dressed her down in front of patients or families. Instead, he'd done something far more lethal: he'd made her problem someone else's problem. By shifting her to the night clinic, he transferred the liability, the oversight, the uncomfortable questions about what she'd seen in those redacted files into a facility where she'd have minimal institutional power, minimal supervision, minimal connection to Sacred Heart's administrative structure. On Thursday afternoon, Brooke was standing at the supply cabinet on the 4th floor, counting surgical instruments for the evening inventory, when the overhead system crackled. Not the intercom that meant administrative announcements. The code alert system. Code Blue, ICU East. Code Blue, ICU East. The words hit her like a physical blow. ICU East. The Ranger. It had to be. Her hands froze mid-count. A syringe clattered to the tile floor with a sound like a shell casing hitting concrete. For one instant, maybe two, she stood absolutely motionless. Every instinct inherited from 20 years of combat medicine screamed at her to move, to run, to get to that bed and assess and intervene. But she wasn't authorized for the ICU anymore. 30 seconds later, she was moving anyway, the supply cabinet forgotten, her body responding to something deeper than institutional protocol. The 4th floor corridor was empty. Everyone who could respond was already running toward the elevators or the stairs. She took the stairs 3 at a time, muscle memory taking over, her legs moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd run into burning buildings and didn't remember fear, only the rhythm of boots on hard ground. The ICU doors were restricted access. The badge reader required an authorization code she no longer possessed. She slowed for just a moment, close enough to see through the observation windows into the trauma room. Close enough to see chaos. Close enough to see her patient, the young ranger with the redacted file and the inconsistent injuries, crashing. His chest wound had reopened. Arterial spray painted the sheets crimson, a Rorschach blot of dying. 2 residents stood frozen, their hands hovering uselessly above his body like they were trying to perform surgery without actually touching anything. The attending was overwhelmed, one voice calling out numbers, blood pressure dropping, oxygen sat plummeting, rhythm deteriorating, while 3 nurses worked in practiced panic that bordered on drowning. Dr. Caldwell was in surgery. The unit director was 3 rooms down. No one was commanding the room. The security guard stationed at the ICU entrance was young, maybe 26, with the kind of face that suggested his biggest concern that morning had been whether his shift would be boring. He didn't even turn to look at her until she was practically beside him. "I need access," Brooke said. Her voice sounded like a rock slide in a canyon, distant, inevitable, impossible to stop. "You're not on the ICU roster. Code Blue. That patient needs intervention he's not getting. Not your floor." The guard shifted his weight, his hand moving closer to his radio. He wasn't being cruel or even particularly officious. He was just following protocol. He was just doing his job. Brooke watched the monitor through the observation window for exactly 3 seconds. She saw the line flattening. She saw the rhythm degrading. She saw a young man who'd survived Marja, who'd survived whatever classified trauma had landed him in a redacted hospital file, dying while people stood around him frozen. She moved. The guard grabbed her arm, a solid grip, trained but not violent. "You can't go in there." She twisted, a combat disarm so smooth and economical that it looked almost accidental. His hand released. She was already moving through the doors before he could radio security. The attending looked up for just a fraction of a second, his face cycling through confusion to recognition to something that might have been relief. "Who are you?" "The nurse who's going to save him," Brooke said. She wasn't asking for permission. She was stating fact. The ranger's vitals were catastrophic. Blood pressure 60/40 and dropping, the kind of numbers that meant death was minutes away. Oxygen saturation 78% and falling. The chest tube from his initial injury had shifted or dislodged. His lungs were filling. He was drowning in his own blood. A surgical resident with trembling hands tried to step forward. We called for the attending surgeon. "Get me a chest tube kit," Brooke said. Her voice had dropped an octave. Every word was an order. "I'm the attending." "I'll." "Get me the kit." 14-gauge needle. 6.5 endotracheal tube. Tape. Dressings. She'd already moved to the bedside, her hands moving on their own, her muscle memory 2 decades old taking over completely. There was an MRE package on the instrument tray. Someone had been eating lunch in the trauma room, because that's what happened in civilian hospitals. People treated them like break rooms instead like battlefields. She grabbed the plastic wrapping, tore it clean, her fingers working with the precision of someone who'd performed emergency interventions in combat situations where supplies didn't exist. She fashioned an improvised chest seal from the packaging material, her movements so economical and precise that the attending stopped moving, just watched. Pressure here. Seal here. Occlusive dressing at the apex of the tension. One piece of tape securing the seal at 3 edges, the 4th edge left open as a flutter valve to allow air out but not in. The ranger's oxygen saturation climbed. 78. 82. 88. Blood pressure stabilized at 92/56, still critically low, but no longer hemorrhagic collapse. His breathing deepened. The pink tinge fading from his lips. Brooke stepped back, her hands covered in arterial blood, her heart rate steady as a metronome. She'd just crossed a line that would end everything. She'd just assaulted a security guard and assumed control of a medical emergency without authorization. She'd just demonstrated competencies that no floor nurse should possess. And that was when Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway. His face went absolutely white. Not the white of shock or surprise. The white of a man who'd seen the invisible thing he'd been trying to erase suddenly become completely, irrevocably visible. The Tuesday code wasn't supposed to happen. Routine vitals check at 11:19 a.m., the morning shift running smoothly, the young Army Ranger stable for the first time in 4 days, his color improving, his oxygen saturation holding at 94% on minimal support. Brooke was in the medication room when the monitor alarm cut through the ambient hospital noise like a blade. She knew that pitch. Knew what it meant before her feet moved toward the sound. Room 347. The Ranger's room. She pushed through the doorway and stopped. The resident nurse, a girl named Martinez, maybe 6 months out of school, stood frozen beside the bed, her hands hanging useless at her sides. The Ranger's dressing had shifted. The improvised surgical bandage Dr. Caldwell had applied during the initial intake was coming loose, and the suture line beneath it had split open like a mouth screaming. Blood ran down his chest in rivulets thick as rope. Not the dark ooze of venous bleeding. Bright red arterial spray, the kind that didn't forgive hesitation. "Call trauma surgery," Brooke said. Not a question. A command. Martinez blinked at her. "Dr. Caldwell's in the OR. He's been in surgery since." "Call them anyway. And get me a senior resident. Now." The heart monitor was screaming. 85. 90. 110. The Ranger's eyes were still closed, still sedated, unaware that his body was betraying him one drop at a time. Brooke's hands were already moving before her brain had finished the calculation. She'd been a field medic before she was a nurse, and muscle memory didn't ask permission. Didn't hesitate. Didn't require a doctor's signature. She grabbed the emergency crash cart. Tore open a sterile field on the bedside table. The Ranger's blood was warm against her palms as she worked, muscle memory taking the wheel, hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of a woman who'd done this while bullets cut the air around her, who'd sealed a sucking chest wound on a child with trembling hands made steady by training and pure will. There. On the shelf. A visitor had left an MRE package, meals ready to eat, military issue, tucked beside a vase of flowers someone's family had brought. Brooke grabbed it, tore it open. The plastic pouch inside was exactly what she needed. She pulled a size 14 angiocath needle from the crash cart, gauze, medical tape. Not ideal. But battlefield medicine had taught her that ideal was a luxury you didn't have when someone was dying. The attending, a senior resident named Dr. Okonkwo, appeared in the doorway, pale. "What happened?" "Suture failure," Brooke said. "Bleeding's arterial. We need to seal this before he goes into hemorrhagic shock." She was already moving. The plastic from the MRE package would work as an occlusive dressing. She'd done this in Marja with even less, with field dressings made from parachute cord and petroleum gauze, with her hands shaking from fear and adrenaline while the child she was carrying screamed against her chest. This was different. This was clean. This was a hospital. This was just a chest wound on a stable patient, nothing compared to what she'd survived. But her hands didn't know the difference. They just knew what to do. "Brooke, you can't," Okonkwo started. "Watch me." She cleaned the wound site with swift, economical movements. No wasted motion. No hesitation. The plastic went down first, sealed against the bleeding edges. Medical tape followed, the kind of improvised chest seal that was field medicine standard, occlusive on 3 sides, vented on the 4th so air could escape without letting blood spray back in. She'd taught this technique to 17 junior medics in Marja. She'd performed it under fire. She'd done it in the dark with her eyes closed because the cave-in had killed the generator and bleeding didn't stop just because you couldn't see. The heart monitor's rhythm steadied. 110. 105. 98. The blood flow slowed, then stopped. The ranger's oxygen saturation climbed back up, 94, 96, 98. His color returned like someone turning up the dimmer on a lamp. Dr. Okonkwo was staring at her hands. Where did you learn that?" "Experience," Brooke said. She didn't look up. Didn't explain. Didn't mention the dust storms or the gunfire or the fact that she'd carried a child named Kareem through 2 miles of Taliban territory with this exact technique keeping his chest cavity intact while rounds punched through the walls around her. Some things didn't need explaining. 1 hour later, the ranger was stable. Fully stable. His vitals locked into a rhythm that promised recovery, his surgical team notified and standing by, his bleeding contained and his wound properly dressed. Brooke stood at his bedside, checking the seal one final time, making sure the tape was holding, making sure nothing had shifted. Her hands were steady. Her heart rate was normal. She'd moved from crisis mode back to baseline the way a switch flipped, training that had cost her everything. The doorway darkened. Dr. Caldwell stood there in surgical scrubs, mask pulled down around his neck, sweat marks staining the cotton at his collar. His eyes traveled from the ranger to the improvised chest seal to Brooke's face, and the color drained from his skin like someone had pulled a plug. Not the white of shock or surprise. The white of understanding. The white of a man watching an invisible thing become completely, irrevocably visible. He stared at her hands. At the technique she'd used. At the evidence written in sutures and tape and the blood that still stained her fingers despite the gloves she'd worn. His jaw clenched. Once. Twice. Then he turned and walked out of the room without speaking. She should have known it wasn't over. Should have recognized that silence for what it was, the silence before a door slams. The silence before consequences. She followed him into the corridor. Dr. Caldwell. He kept walking. Didn't slow down. Didn't acknowledge her. He moved through the hospital like a man on a ticking clock, his pace quickening as he headed toward his office, his hands already reaching for something, his phone, she realized. His phone. His hand rose to his ear before he'd even closed the office door, and through the window she watched him speak. Watched his lips move. Watched his free hand gesture, sharp and precise. She couldn't hear the words. Didn't need to. Security arrived 14 minutes later. 2 guards in the slate-grey uniforms that meant this wasn't a request. They came to the unit floor, scanned the room numbers, and found her standing at the medication cart, still doing her job, still moving through the motions of being a nurse who belonged here. Nurse Sullivan? The first guard had a name tag that read Patterson. His voice was neutral. The voice of someone following orders. You need to come with us. Is something wrong? We just need you to collect your belongings and exit the facility. Dr. Caldwell's orders. The unit went quiet. Every head turned. Every pair of eyes locked onto her like she was contagious. Linda from the break room. Jessica from the supply closet. The attending who'd watched her perform a battlefield medical procedure with nothing but an MRE package and her own hands. They all stared like they'd never seen her before, or like they were seeing her for the first time, and neither option felt survivable. Brooke didn't argue. Didn't explain. Didn't ask for clarification. She set down the medication tray, pulled off her gloves, and walked toward her locker with Patterson and the second guard flanking her like an escort. Like she was a threat that needed containment. The locker was 4 doors down from the break room. Inside were 4 years of accumulated small things, a spare stethoscope, a pair of compression socks, a fleece jacket for the cold emergency department bays. She gathered them slowly, carefully, aware of every pair of eyes that had shifted to watch her move. The faded unit patch was in her jacket pocket, had been in her jacket pocket for 2 decades, sewn into the lining so carefully that no one would ever see it unless they knew where to look. You're done here, Patterson said. Your badge, please. She unclipped it from her scrubs and handed it over. The badge she'd worn every day for 3 years, the one that said, Brooke Sullivan, RN, with her photograph from her interview, her hair longer then, her eyes still holding something that looked like hope. You can't come back on hospital grounds, the second guard said. Those are Dr. Caldwell's terms. Violation of restricted access, scope of practice, protocol breach. You understand? Brooke nodded. Didn't speak. Didn't look at the unit board where her write-up was still posted, the falsified medication error printed in official hospital letterhead. Didn't look at the break room where the other nurses had abandoned her 1 cup of coffee at a time. She walked out through the emergency department doors, and the night air hit her like a wall of water. 8:00 p.m. The parking garage stretched out in front of her, fluorescent lights casting everything in sick yellow tones, and she moved toward her car like she was moving through someone else's dream. The locker sat on her passenger seat once she'd closed the door. 4 years of belongings in a plastic hospital tote. She set her palms against the steering wheel and pressed her forehead down, didn't turn on the engine, didn't cry, didn't move. The engine was dead. The car was dead. She was dead. Somewhere in the parking garage, a door slammed. Footsteps echoed. The world kept moving. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd saved him, had used the only thing she had left, the only skill that mattered, the only piece of the woman she used to be, and it had changed nothing. Dr. Caldwell had made a single phone call and erased her anyway. Not because she was wrong. Because she was real. Because her hands had moved with the muscle memory of Major Brooke Sullivan, Reaper 6, the medic who'd carried a child through 2 miles of fire, and that reality was more dangerous to him than any mistake she could have made. The faded unit patch lay on the passenger seat beside her, the only proof she'd ever been anything other than just a nurse. She reached for it with trembling fingers. Held it. Closed her eyes. And for the first time in 20 years, Major Brooke Sullivan allowed herself to stop fighting the fact that she'd never really come home at all. 3 days passed like a held breath nobody was allowed to release. Brooke moved through Sacred Heart like a ghost permitted only daytime haunting. The locker in the break room, the one with the dented metal door and a name tag that had already started to yellow, came open to her hand on a Tuesday morning at 6:15. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar institutional monotone. Nobody else was there yet. Nobody had to be. They'd made it clear with the way they left the room when she sat down, with the way they stopped talking mid-sentence, with the way her presence had become a silence that required explanation. She pulled out the stethoscope she'd carried for 3 years at Sacred Heart. The chest piece had the small nick in the metal where she dropped it once on linoleum. She coiled it around her neck one final time, then unwound it slowly and placed it in a duffel bag with the rest of her life. The scrubs came next, with the 3 sets she kept clean and pressed for 12-hour shifts. The small bottle of hand sanitizer she kept in her pocket because sanitizer stations ran dry during codes. The notebook where she'd documented every medication she'd given, every vital sign she'd recorded, every single thing that proved she'd done her job perfectly because perfection was the only armor she had left. The write-up was still there on the unit board. She didn't look at it. She could feel it like a brand on the back of her neck. Dr. Caldwell appeared at 7:32 in a pressed suit the color of asphalt, his face carrying that particular satisfaction that men wear when they've successfully erased something they found threatening. He didn't speak to her. He didn't need to. The hospital administrator walked beside him with a woman whose name Brooke had learned was Jennifer Marsh, whose job it was to process the paperwork that made invisible people official. The administrator held a folder. The folder held Brooke's termination letter, 3 copies, one with a signature line. Everything was happening in the language of bureaucracy now. Hospitals ran on protocol. Protocol was where people like Dr. Caldwell won and people like Brooke disappeared. Jennifer Marsh stopped at the unit board and read the write-up. Her mouth tightened at the corners. Medication error, she said quietly. Patient outcome. Patient is stable, Dr. Caldwell said smoothly. No permanent harm. But the protocol violation was documented. Clear procedure breach. The nurse in question was terminated during night shift yesterday by hospital security, per my authorization. The administrator nodded slowly. She didn't look toward the break room where Brooke was visible through the small square window in the door, holding an empty duffel bag that suddenly weighed as much as proof of existence. What the administrator didn't know was waiting in a room 3 floors above, where a young Army Ranger who'd been sedated for 72 hours began to wake up with his eyes moving underneath his eyelids, with his fingers twitching against the hospital blanket, with his body remembering how to want consciousness again. Brooke zipped the duffel bag at exactly 7:41 in the morning. She slung it over her shoulder. The faded unit patch was still sewn inside her jacket lining, the one piece of her that nobody had found permission to remove. She touched it once through the fabric, a secret handshake with a woman who no longer existed, and then she turned toward the door. One last walk past the unit board. One last corridor. One last. The elevator doors opened on the 6th floor and Brooke didn't take them. She'd been told by security not to access the ICU level. There was probably a notation about it somewhere in her termination paperwork. But she found her feet moving toward the stairs anyway, up the concrete echoes, past the 3rd floor landing, up to where they kept the Rangers and the soldiers and the broken people who deserved better than Dr. Caldwell's careful lies. The ICU corridor was quiet in that specific way that meant someone was waking up. Machines beeped in a new pattern. Someone had adjusted the monitors. She walked past the nurses' station without looking at them, and when she passed the Ranger's room, she kept her eyes forward because she'd already said goodbye to this life and goodbyes were temporary and she couldn't afford temporary anymore. His eyes found hers. Not the room finding her eyes. Him. The young Army Ranger, Kane, his name was Kane, who'd been sedated deep enough that consciousness shouldn't have been possible yet. His eyes locked onto her face like target acquisition, like recognition, like a memory surfacing through water that was supposed to keep him under. His mouth moved. His hand came up from the hospital blanket. "Reaper," he whispered. The word shattered the corridor. It echoed off linoleum and equipment and the careful architecture of institutional silence. Reaper. A call sign nobody at Sacred Heart had ever spoken. A call sign that belonged to a woman who'd been ordered by the Pentagon to disappear, who'd spent 20 years proving she could do exactly that, who'd almost made it all the way to the end of her career at Sacred Heart without anyone knowing what her hands had been trained to do. Reaper 6, Kane said, louder now, his voice breaking through sedation and pain medication and 20 years of careful burial. Major Sullivan pulled me out of a burning building in Marja. I was 8 years old. There was fire and she carried me 2 miles through enemy fire and nobody told me she lived. They said she died. Everyone said she died. The unit nurse pulled Kane's file with trembling hands. The emergency contact section contained a handwritten note in medical shorthand: child evacuee, extreme trauma, psychological evaluation recommended, note added by combat medic on scene. The note had a signature: Major M. Sullivan, 75th Ranger Regiment, JSOC attachment. That was Brooke. That had always been Brooke. The hospital had just never understood that she was that person, that some people's lives didn't fit on a resume, that the most dangerous nurses were the ones who'd already held death in their hands and knew exactly how to refuse it. A stone-faced lieutenant colonel appeared in the corridor at 8:17 in the morning. He wasn't hospital personnel. He carried his rank the way some people carry loaded weapons, carefully, aware that the weight required respect. He moved to the unit board where Jennifer Marsh was still standing, still reading, still processing the fact that the paperwork in her folder was about to become evidence instead of official record. Major Sullivan, the lieutenant colonel said. His voice was granite with decades of command underneath it. Your military decorations. We should probably make the record clear. He opened a folder. He was formal about it, military formal, the kind of precise where every word carries consequences. Bronze Star with Valor, he said. The hospital board turned. Silence. A heartbeat. A breath. Purple Heart, he continued. 2 of them. Dr. Caldwell's face went the color of old bone. Combat medical badge. The lieutenant colonel's voice didn't change inflection. Combat medic attached to JSOC Task Force 121 for 12 years. 3 tours in Helmand Province. Classified service record. The Pentagon erased her documentation in 2004 after a political incident that was not her error. The administrator looked at Dr. Caldwell. You terminated a decorated combat veteran. I didn't know, Caldwell's voice cracked. She never mentioned. She shouldn't have to, the lieutenant colonel said quietly. Major Sullivan's service was classified. She was ordered to disappear. She's been living under observation for 20 years. And you tried to destroy her. The administrator's hand came up to her mouth. When she lowered it, her eyes had gone hard. She pulled another file from her desk, the investigation she'd initiated against Brooke, the one Dr. Caldwell had requested, the systematic documentation of supposed medication errors and protocol violations that had never actually occurred. Dr. Caldwell, she said, her voice carrying the temperature of ice. This investigation you initiated, the State Medical Board ran an audit. Preliminary findings. She read from the papers. 3 surgical complications you documented as nursing errors were attributed to registered nurse Sullivan. But the surgical notes show your signature on the initial procedure. She looked up. You falsified patient charts to cover your own mistakes. Caldwell backed up a step. Staff Sergeant Kane's injury patterns don't match his file because you altered his treatment records, the administrator continued. You nicked an artery during initial surgery and kept him sedated to prevent him from telling anyone. You tried to bury the one nurse who recognized battlefield injuries when she saw them. 2 military police officers appeared in the corridor. They didn't touch Caldwell. They didn't need to. The gravity of what was happening pulled toward him like an undertow. The lieutenant colonel's voice was the voice of someone who'd commanded through firefights and negotiations and decisions that cost lives. You're done, Doctor. The MPs will escort you out. The medical board will have your license by end of week. Caldwell looked around the unit, at the nurses who'd once followed his orders, at the residents who'd hung on his words like doctrine, at the entire ecosystem of power he'd constructed through fear and precision and the careful administration of professional humiliation. They all turned away. Linda, the veteran nurse who'd abandoned Brooke in the break room, whose coffee cup had disappeared when Brooke sat down, whose support had dried up the moment Dr. Caldwell's retaliation began, Linda met Brooke's eyes from across the unit floor. Her mouth formed a single word, sorry. Caldwell was walked out past the unit board where Brooke's write-up still hung. He was walked past the break room where Brooke had stood alone with her duffel bag. He was walked past the world he'd controlled, toward the elevator, toward the parking garage, toward the long fall that begins the moment the people underneath you stop holding you up. The administrator closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she looked directly at Brooke. "Major Sullivan," she said. "Or do you prefer to be called Brooke?" Brooke's voice had changed. Nobody who wasn't military would have heard it, the way she dropped the deferential register, the way she stood straighter, the way the nurse in her had stepped back to make room for the officer underneath. "Brooke is fine," she said. "We'd like to offer you the ICU director position. Full authority. Your medical background, your tactical experience, that's exactly what our trauma program needs." Brooke considered. The patch inside her jacket seemed to pulse with 20 years of invisibility, with the weight of a child she'd carried through fire, with a quiet knowledge that some services required forgetting yourself completely. "One condition," she said. "Any veteran who comes through those doors gets the care they deserve. No questions. No hiding." "Done," the administrator said. In the ranger's room, Kane was watching for her. When she appeared in the doorway, his eyes filled with water that had nothing to do with the 4 fluids running into his arm. "I thought you were dead," he said. "They told us everyone was dead." She stepped into the room and closed the door. "They told me I never existed." She pulled the patch from her jacket lining for the first time in 20 years, not sewn in the shadows anymore, but real and visible, and proof that she was Reaper 6, that she was Major Sullivan, that she had carried an 8-year-old boy through 2 miles of enemy fire in Marja, and apparently that meant something. That meant she mattered. That meant she'd always been real, even when the Pentagon tried to erase her name and the hospital tried to erase her presence and Dr. Caldwell tried to erase her future. She rested her hand on the patch and watched the young ranger sleep, healing, preparing to return to active duty, preparing to live the life she'd preserved for him by refusing to let him die in that moment when everything fell apart. Her hands had held him. Her hands had saved him. Her hands had always been worth remembering. 6 months later, Dr. Caldwell was selling supplemental insurance from a folding table outside a strip mall pharmacy in Durham, his license revoked, his reputation destroyed by the investigation he'd weaponized against a woman who turned out to be the kind of person the Pentagon itself refused to forget. She heard about it through professional networks, the way people talk about things that feel like justice. She felt no satisfaction, only the quiet knowledge that the truth has its own weight and eventually it crushes the architecture built to contain it. If you're watching this, you already know that hidden strength lives inside ordinary people, inside the ones who clean up without complaint, who show up for the impossible codes, who carry secrets that could reshape institutions if anyone had the courage to listen. Brooke Sullivan is now the ICU director at Sacred Heart in Raleigh, and every veteran who walks through those doors gets the care they deserve. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Tell us about a time you were underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value.